All right. So, first thing I want to talk to you guys about is the link that I posted up last night for the Google Drive. So, I made a Google Drive so that way all the stuff can be accessed, even if Edsby is down. So, if you save that link to a bookmark, that'll allow you to be able to open it, access everything for literally now through the end of the year. I put everything on there. So, from Edsby, whenever you go to the actual setup here, I'll start sharing my screen. So on Edsby, if it actually works right now, which I don't know if it will or not, um, when you're actually into Edsby, you'll log on, and then the post that I had last night, yeah, that's not gonna work. Will open up this file. It says regular and honors world history, and it's got each one of the weeks set up here. Now, technically, we're only going to end right here as of right now, but the rest of the stuff is up here too. If you ever forget about the Zoom links or anything like that, there's a file right here, and it's got links for the Zoom meetings. So you can just click the link for Tuesdays and Thursdays right there. For the office hours part, I'm online every day from 1 to 3 to answer questions. So during this part, I'm going to kind of be presenting everything, posting it later, so that way if you miss it, you can see it later. But for the office hours part, that's when you can come in and ask any questions that you guys have about things. And that's going to be this one, right? Um, but if you know, like I said, everything's down with Edsby, you can simply look on it. The date's right here. So from March 30th to April 3rd. Here's the reading part. Here's the Google form where you'll actually answer things and submit stuff. About 18 people have already submitted it, so that's cool. And if you feel like reading ahead, I've already got the readings in here for the rest of the year, along with the semester review. So literally everything is planned end of the year already. And again, this is here so that way, even if Edsby crashes and it's down, you can still access everything. So I know Edsby has been kind of a pain for everybody, but you can get to everything on it this way, right? But that's that. So for class today, I'm going to talk through stuff. I'm going to try to get through the first 2 lessons on the start of World War II. If you are reading the reading parts and you're like, man, I wish that I had more about this, there's a lot more information and a lot more things that can help you in the actual textbook site. So to get to the textbook site, if you go to Clever, you guys don't have as many things as I do on here, but what you're going to look for is this one that says McGraw-Hill. So if you get to the one, it says that usually it's all the way down at the bottom. Whenever you guys click that, it's going to open up like the actual thing for you. You might not have to log in. You might, either way, just log in again with your same information. And then it's going to show all the textbooks that you guys have access to. Now, obviously, I have the teacher edition, you have the student edition, but you're going to look for the one that has the compass on it. Right now, this is going to be the actual textbook. So if you click on the textbook itself, once you actually get here, you can go to the chapter, which we're on chapter 30 now, all the way at the end. So you click on the chapter, and then it literally has all of the lesson information in here. So like lesson 1, hit go, and it is your textbook right here. So all of the pages are right here, and it's the actual like big orange thick textbook, the hardcover one. So if you're looking for additional information, there's a ton of stuff in here. You can look at everything in here. It's got a bunch of stuff to just add additional information for you. But without any further ado, I figured I'd get through lesson 1 and 2, talk about the start of World War II, and then up to the point where the United States joins in, and then from there on, I'll be able to answer any questions you guys have during the office hours part. So if you have questions throughout the time whenever I'm talking, simply type them into the chat bar and send it to me. It's only going to let you send messages to me. I'm not guaranteeing that I will answer them as they come up. What I am telling you is I for sure will post the answers to your questions that you type up now, right? So leading up to World War II, I'm going to shut this because that's really loud. There's several different agreements that lead up to World War II. Some of the bigger ones, the Rome and Berlin axis. So before we left for spring break, the last thing we talked about was kind of how Hitler was coming to power along with Stalin and Mussolini. And this is the deal that Hitler and Mussolini formally agreed to. So in October 1936, Germany and Italy decided they are going to be allies. Right after that, in November, so literally a month later, Germany and Japan signed their treaty. Germany and Japan agree to work together against communism and especially against the Soviet Union. They both hate them. Hitler hates communists, so thus they really, really want to get everything like broken apart within the Soviet Union. And my screen just went blank for a second, which is weird. All right, and then after that we have the Munich Conference. When the Munich Conference happens, this is what is widely considered to be the biggest failure of the Allies. This is going to be when appeasement happens, and it's when all of the Allied forces, so whenever you look at France and Great Britain, they basically give Hitler what he wants in hopes that if they just give him what he wants, he won't get super angry and take over the rest of the continent. So that's what they think is going to happen here, right? So Germany, Italy, France, and Great Britain show up. And they say that eventually Germany is going to be allowed to take control of the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is essentially the area around Germany that speaks German, that essentially is part German in tradition. They also agree to give them a section of Czechoslovakia, and we'll look at all that stuff on a map later on too. And then the big one is the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, and that's when Germany and the Soviet Union make a deal and say, all right, we won't attack each other, we'll leave each other alone, we'll dominate everyone else in the world, but we won't fight with one another. This is a big deal because at the time they're the two biggest powers in Europe, and now that they've made a deal, they make sure that this is a secret thing. This is not broadcast to everyone else. This is totally backdoor secret stuff. So in the 1930s, Germany invaded neighboring countries to gain resources and land. After World War I, their country was completely broke. The inflation was crazy. Nobody had anything. So they needed to gain more resources. Hitler allied with Italy. He annexed Austria, and he occupies the Sudetenland. So we talked about some of those already, but the big one here is that he annexed Austria. Austria literally gives itself to Germany. It says, here, you can have our country, you can run it, you're going to do great, we know you're amazing. Hitler forms an alliance with the Soviet Union, like we just said there, which ultimately allows him to gain the freedom to invade Poland. That's going to be the thing that starts the war. When Germany invades Poland, that is what starts World War II. All of the other world powers were reluctant to engage in war. Nobody wanted to have another world war. They just saw how devastating World War I was. They saw how deadly it was and how terrifying it was for all the people involved. So they really didn't want to go to war again. That's the last thing that they wanted to do. So when Germany actually invades Poland, everyone is super upset because it means that they're going to have to go to war again, and nobody wanted to. So on March 7th, 1936, Germany stuns Europe by quietly marching troops into the Rhineland. And we're going to look at that on a map in a minute, too. This is a territory that had been occupied by France since the end of World War I. Hitler's actions were partially in response to the Franco-Soviet Pact in 1935, in which France and the Soviet Union pledged assistance in the case of unprovoked German attack on their country. Right? My screen just went black again. This cable sucks, apparently. Hitler calculated that France and Great Britain were too divided internally to take the decisive action that would be needed to expel his troops. He was correct. France and Great Britain both didn't really want to go to war, like we just said, so they really, really didn't want everything to kind of happen. So they were very much set on trying to just make everybody happy. So despite weak protests and Hitler's repudiation or rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and Locarno, no one was willing to meet his aggression with force. Thereafter, an emboldened Germany would rearm and plot its conquest of Europe, knowing its aggression would be met only by appeasement. Right? So we're going to watch this quick video. I don't know if you guys.
Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, were careful to say to the world that they would win this fight.
So the Soviets invaded from the east side, Germany invaded from the west side, and even though Germany was first and everyone declared war on them, nobody really seems to blame the Soviets for invading Poland on their side. Even though they were supposed to be, Poland was supposed to be protected by Germany and France, when the Soviets invade them, they basically say, oh, well, maybe they were doing it to stop Hitler. But in reality, it was just part of the deal that Hitler made with Stalin. So when the Soviets actually came marching through, when they took over the eastern part of Poland, they never leave. They stay there all the way until 1990. The Polish residents that were there didn't realize that they just got completely taken over. They almost thought they were there to help them, but they weren't. Right? So by the time that all of this happens, there's big things that have already occurred when Hitler has broken parts of the Treaty of Versailles. So in March of 1935, Hitler announces the creation of a new air force. This was supposed to be illegal. And after that, Hitler institutes a military draft to expand the army from 100,000 to 550,000. Again, supposed to be illegal. And then in 1936, Hitler deploys troops in the demilitarized Rhineland, which again, supposed to be illegal. Throughout this whole time, Germany has been supporting its allies kind of within Europe. So Germany supports Italy whenever Italy goes in and invades Ethiopia. German and Italian troops aid General Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. They actually end up causing Franco to win that war. After that, Germany and Italy create a new alliance known as the Rome-Berlin Axis, or as the Americans would later call it, the Axis of Evil. So, we'll knock all these things off first. So at the beginning, we've got the actual area that is Germany, right? So within Germany, the Rhineland is this spot here that's colored different, right? So within the Rhineland, this is supposed to be an area where no soldiers were allowed. That was part of the deal from the Treaty of Versailles. But one of the first things that Hitler does once he fully gains power is he sends his military there. He does this so that way, if they need to attack into France, they can, right? After that, in the following years of appeasement, Germany eventually gets all of this. So it starts with just the Sudetenland, which is this little part right around here. But then eventually he gets all of Czechoslovakia, all of Austria, and now Germany has become this, right? Italy has been over here. It's consisted of basically its natural borders. But then on top of that, within the next 4 years after that, they also add Albania. They take over here. This is going to help, especially later on, whenever they try to gain access to Yugoslavia. So the Munich Conference. So there's a couple people here. Hitler is right here. He was the leader of the Germans during the Nazi era. In March of 1939, just a few months after the Munich Pact allowed him to take the Sudetenland, Hitler annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia. The next guy, you've got Sir Neville Henderson. He was a British ambassador in Berlin. He was influential in Neville Chamberlain, who we'll talk about in a second here, policy of appeasement. He's the guy who thought, hey, if we just make Hitler happy, maybe he won't attack everything. And then we get to Neville Chamberlain. He was the British Prime Minister from 1937 to 1940. He returned to Great Britain following the Munich Conference, proclaiming that the Munich Agreement would guarantee peace in Europe. It doesn't. This is going to be one of his essentially downfall moments where he declares that this agreement is going to be everlasting peace, and it doesn't even last a year. Joachim von Ribbentrop was Hitler's chief advisor on foreign affairs after the Nazi Party gained power in Germany. He was responsible for negotiating most of Germany's treaties. He does a wonderful job for Hitler. He gets Germany to gain a lot of things without actually having to go to war. Germany gets all of Austria, all of Czechoslovakia without firing a single bullet. They just give it over to him. They just hand him the country. At the Munich Conference in 1938, representatives from Germany, Great Britain, Italy, and France all agreed to allow Germany to take over the Sudetenland. In this photograph that was taken on September 29th of 1938 shows Hitler, Henderson, Chamberlain, and Ribbentrop passing the German Guard of Honor. So the German Guard is all here. And then we'll look at the other major country involved. So the other one that we have over here is Japan. So Japan invaded neighboring countries in the 1930s to acquire valuable resources. Japan then seizes Manchuria, which is at the northern part of China, and then it eventually expands into Chinese land and ends up resulting in war with China. Japan launches essentially a surprise attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor, and then other European colonies in Southeast Asia, and essentially catches a lot of the Europeans by surprise. So to look at Japan, Japan's traditional area that it had before this, they had control over all of their island, as well as some of the other ones. If you recall, at the end of World War I, they had already gained Taiwan, and they had already kind of posted up over here. They have control over Korea, and they've taken over Manchuria. Right? So they've taken over all of these areas. Over the next 8 years, Japan also adds all of this area within China. It runs up through Nanjing. It takes over Beijing and parts of Inner Mongolia, but it also takes over all of these little islands. So all of the islands over here, all the way up to very close to Hawaii, right? When it does all of this, this is seen as an immediate threat because, as you can see, France owns territory here. Britain owns territory here. The Netherlands are here. The United States owns the Philippines that's over here. All of these are starting to look like Japan is going to essentially try to challenge the other European and American countries. The end result here is the bombing of Shanghai, which at the time was one of China's biggest cities and still is. Japan goes in, bombs the city, they firebomb, they kill a bunch of civilians, and it ends up being a rather effective way to completely take China out of the picture. Japan claims that the New Order was a system of control dedicated to increasing prosperity for Asian neighbors. They thought that they should be in charge of this new order. Japan acquires parts of China and French Indochina, which it ran under military rule. Japan exploited raw materials in Southeast Asia to fuel its military machine, and it helps that Japan is also extremely industrialized. Not a lot of other Asian countries were. Eventually, because of all of these risks, war with European colonial powers and the United States ends up happening. Once all of the European countries and the United States have declared war on Japan, things are going to be a lot worse for them. The United States also has economic sanctions against them, which means that they no longer allow them to gain iron or oil. And you kind of need those things to build things like tanks and planes and ships. Right? So that's the lead up to the war. Once we get into the actual war, and this is going to be like the lesson 2 portion of everything. The war starts when Germany invades Poland using what is called blitzkrieg. So blitzkrieg means lightning war. So lightning war. Hey, right? When Hitler invades Poland in 1939, it completely stuns the rest of Europe. Like we just talked about in November of 1938, Neville Chamberlain said that there was going to be peace in Europe for all time now because of this sweet deal that he negotiated. And then less than a year later, Hitler invades Poland and takes over the whole country. In 1940, Germany successfully attacked Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. It takes over all of those countries in a year. To put this in perspective, in World War I, after 5 years of fighting, they didn't get any of those. But in less than a year in World War II, Germany takes over all of these different countries. They get all the way into France. They go right through the Belgium and the Netherlands. But then they try to attack Britain. And Britain's got the advantage of being an island. So it's not like you can take your tanks and cross over the British, over into the British territory. So instead, they have to rely on their air force, essentially, to come in and bomb them from afar, right? So when the Air Force goes in and bombs Britain, they try over and over and over again to try and actually get them to stop and essentially surrender. But it doesn't happen. This is also where one of the biggest lies of all time that your parents have been telling you for your whole life is kind of comes about. During this time period, the British have a massive discovery in that they discover radar. So they figure out that they can use radar to see German planes when they're coming, and also know where they're at, even if it's at night. When this occurs, the Germans are completely caught off guard. They have no idea how they know when they're coming. They're able to sound sirens and warn all their citizens so they can hide and get in safe locations. And the Germans don't know why. So the British come up with one of the greatest lies of all time that your parents have all told you as well. And the British response is that they eat a lot of carrots. And carrots allow them to see better, and that's how they can see all the planes from far away. And the Germans totally go, I guess it's real. I guess that's true. We're going to have to run with it. But that's where that comes from. Carrots don't actually improve your eyesight. Hate to break that one to you, but all because the British lied and said that that's how they were able to see the planes at night, is why you end up being told by your parents that carrots make you see better. In 1941, Hitler wrongly assumed that German forces would decisively defeat the Soviet Union. This is going to be the reason why, ultimately, the Germans lose the war. When Germany decided to attack the Soviets, they do it completely by surprise, right? So Hitler and the Soviet Union had a deal that they weren't going to attack each other. They had an agreement that they wouldn't fight one another. They would just leave each other be. But then Hitler totally goes back on it, and they try to do a surprise attack on the Soviets, and it just doesn't work. They go in June, but in early winter and fierce Soviet resistance halt the German attack, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. When this all happens, the United States says, not our problem. They stand back. They are all the way across the ocean, basically just sitting there saying, that really sucks that Europe's in another war, but it's not us. They are completely neutral. We do sell weapons to the Allies. We don't sell weapons to Hitler, but we don't send any troops. We're not sending weapons for free. We're just selling them, right? So the United States mainly remains neutral during this time. So here's this video.
With the British bombers at the head,
So what it was saying at the end, Molotov was the ambassador from the Soviet Union, and Ribbentrop, like we just saw in the picture before, was the representative from the Nazis. And they realized that they didn't really have any common ground anymore. Here's the biography page of FDR. He was the president of the United States during the time, and essentially is the guy responsible for leading all of the military throughout the war, because that's what presidents do. In the United States, we had what were called the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts were passed by Congress in the 1930s. The acts were intended to prevent the United States from becoming involved in another European war. We didn't want to repeat of World War I because we thought that's why we went into the Great Depression. So we said, all right, well, if that's what happened last time, we really don't want to do it again, right? President Roosevelt believed the Neutrality Acts encouraged Axis aggression. So again, remember the Axis is going to be Italy and Germany at the time, right? So the acts were gradually relaxed as supplies were shipped to Britain, and eventually we started selling weapons and other things to the Allies. When Hitler attacks in the Soviet Union, there's a whole lot of things that are similar to Napoleon, right? So we talked about Napoleon before, and the fact that like the main reason why he lost whenever he invaded Russia is that as he invaded, all of the Russian citizens simply burned all of their fields, slaughtered all of their animals, and just said, fine, you guys can just starve to death then. Good luck getting your supplies here. Well, it's not that different when Hitler invades. Hitler invades and the Russians adopt the same scorched earth strategy. They retreat while destroying all of their crops and other resources, and basically say, we know that we have friends that are further back in Russia, and we know you don't have any food. So good luck surviving, right? Um, the invading French and Nazi armies fail to overcome the Russian defenses before winter sets in. And this is a confusing line because France is not necessarily allied with the Nazis, but since the Nazis have taken over France, they take some of their soldiers and basically force them to work with them. When this happens and when winter sets in, it's terrible. Severe Russian winters catch invaders unprepared, and widespread disease and death results. Almost 80% of all of the Nazis that march into the Soviet Union end up dying from starvation and cold. So they literally freeze to death or they starve to death. It's a terrible, terrible time to invade Russia as the winter. Reserve Russian troops from deep within the country gather and drive out the invaders the following year. When this occurs, all of the soldiers that are all the way in like the middle of nowhere Russia, in the middle of Siberia, it takes them a long time to get from there all the way to where Europe is, right? So once they all show up, it's the added support that they needed in order to defeat the Nazis. This is going to kind of play out and just show you kind of how everything went down. So at the beginning of it all, we've got Germany in the middle here, right? And they're going to essentially start taking things. So this olive green color is going to be things that are Axis powers and Axis controlled territories. So anything that is this bluish green or this ugly green is that. And then boom, everything colors in. All of the yellow are people who were considered to be neutral at the beginning of the war. So all of those countries were neutral at the beginning. Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, the Soviet Union, all of everything down here, all of those were neutral. They didn't want anything to do with the war, right? But when the war starts, the Allied powers are going to be the groups in orange, right? So the Allies join in. The Soviet Union and Germany both collapse in on Poland, and they take it over, right? So the Soviet Union now has this half of Poland. Germany has this half. And now Germany is all kind of this one big collection in the middle, right? After that happens, Germany comes up here, and they invade into here. The Soviets invade up here. And then the Netherlands and Belgium get invaded. So Germany invades the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, even though they were neutral, right? When they do this, they're doing it to avoid this. This is called the Maginot Line. So after World War I, France sets up this massive military defense, and they put all of their massive cannons and all kinds of things and artillery lined up along this line right here. And Germany goes, we'll go around then. And they essentially just attack over this part. Once Germany invades into France, Italy is also coming up from the other side. The French are completely overwhelmed. Like we said, the French lose their entire country in literally a year, right? So after this point, they split it, right? So Vichy France is going to be down here. This other top part, all this green part, is going to be controlled by the Axis, right? This is essentially going to be controlled by itself. It's trying to be like the resistance, if you will. Once we get into the part where the Soviet Union ends up getting attacked, which is going to happen in a couple seconds here, it's scrolling a little bit slower than I want. Once that happens, things start to get a little bit different. So now the Italians start coming over here from Libya into Egypt, and now all of these countries have joined the Allies. Albania invades into Greece down here, and it truly starts becoming a world war, right? So now Egypt and the British are essentially going to try to fight back against the Italians in Africa, while also the Soviets essentially are going to be moving on their own sort of offensive and joining up in here too. So Yugoslavia has now essentially been taken over. All of the rest of this area essentially gets taken over. And we end up with the Soviets joining up with the Allies. The Russians make it all the way through here until they eventually get stopped at Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. These are the three big cities for Russia. If it weren't for these three different battles, they would have been completely overrun. When the Soviets win at Stalingrad, when they win at Leningrad, that's the thing that breaks Germany. After this happens, the Soviets start moving in, and they never stop. If that would have been the only thing that happened, many people think that essentially the Nazis would have had a stalemate. They would have kind of kept at all of control of the middle of Germany, and they probably would have been in control to this day. But unfortunately for them, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. This draws the United States into war. 4 days later, Hitler declares war on the United States, thinking that the U.S. would only fight against Japan and it wouldn't really be effective in the European theater. He's wrong. When Pearl Harbor gets bombed, it completely galvanizes the country. The entirety of the United States gets behind one cause, and we throw everything into the war. When it comes to the casualties, more than 2,000 people die at Pearl Harbor. Another 1,000 people are wounded at Pearl Harbor. When it comes to ships, we lose 100% of our battleships. We lose 37% of all of our cruisers and 10% of our destroyers, right? When it comes to aircraft, we lose 188 of our planes. Japan loses only 29. That's the only amount that we were able to shoot out of the air. This is a devastating attack on the U.S. Navy. Our Navy takes a long time to build back up because Hawaii at the time was our biggest naval base. So when it comes to war in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor happens and then Wake Island happens in December, same year. So both of these attacks occur, both these battles happen in the first year of the war. After that, we're going to see the Battle of Bataan over here. Remember that the United States at the time owned the Philippines. So the Philippines during this time period was a lot like what Puerto Rico is right now. It was a territory that the United States owned and had people there. When this occurs, Japan attacks us here as well. I want to zoom in, but it's going to pop out in a second here. The next one, we got battles within the South China Sea, and then I'll move it around for this part. The Australians help us a little bit. They allow us to have a port there. We eventually have a battle over here in the Coral Sea. And then we also have Corregidor over there. But then the big one's going to happen in a second. So the next major one that we have is the Battle at Midway. This is going to be the turning point. I wanted to stop. And pause. The Battle of Midway is largely seen to be the turning point of the war in the Pacific Ocean. When this happens, we're able to take over and realize that we can bounce from one island to the next and be pretty effective that way. We also come all the way down here. We have Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. This is a big deal too because it knocks Japan out of all of these areas, right? All of the Asian co-prosperity sphere was a group of Asian nations controlled by Japan. So everything in that map that was green was controlled by Japan at the time. This included most of East Asia and the Western Pacific Ocean. And although it promised liberation from Western colonial rule, it was very much dominated by Japan to exploit their natural resources. Japan promised to be an Asian power for Asian peoples, but ended up just kind of dominating those countries as well. The Grand Alliance is then formed. Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union form their own alliance. That's going to be Churchill, Stalin, and FDR. They essentially form and defeat the Axis to defeat the Axis powers, which is Germany, Italy, and Japan. By the fall of 1942, the war had turned against the Axis powers on both the European and Asian theaters of war. And at this point on, the Allies are starting to win. Um, like I said before, the U.S. realized they could do an island hopping strategy. They jumped from one island to the next. They did that in order to capture all of the different Japanese-held islands, so that way they didn't have anywhere to retreat to. It utilized and combined attacks of the U.S. Army, Marines, and the Navy. It focused on capturing some islands and bypassing others to get closer and closer to actual mainland Japan. That was how they thought they were going to be able to get all the way to the main island. Um, and that's going to be where we're going to leave off today. Um, so when it comes to all of like the actual start of the war, and we're into like the middle of it, it's a lot of different things that are happening in information, but it's all about who's on whose side, right? Everything was kind of set up to where one alliance was set up with versus another, a lot like World War One, but this time the sides were a little bit more, we'll say, differentiated there, right? I'm going to end the recording now. I'm going to post this up. I'm going to post a link to Edsby, but I'm actually just going to post this up on my YouTube channel. So I set up a YouTube channel so that way you can view these at any point in time to go back and look at it and help you with anything else. If you have questions, I will be on like my Zoom meeting in the actual, like in my personal meeting room today from 1 until 3. So if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate, show up. All you got to do is just pop in. You can ask your question, talk to me about it, and I'll give you individualized answers on stuff. But that's all my time, so I hope you guys have a great day. And if you got anything else, feel free to let me know, but I'm going to stop the recording now and pause.